Mary Lincoln had been a laudanum drinker, and during the war she'd given seances in the White House for people who'd lost loved ones on the battlefield, and Mary Lincoln had brought a great deal of comfort to many people during those years. After her husband was murdered, Mary Lincoln would be called a mercenary prostitute for selling off her expensive gowns acquired from those years in the White House. Sensitive and fearful, Mary Lincoln moved to Germany, where people were more respectful and well-mannered, and 5 years later, President Grant awarded Mary Lincoln a pension, knowing it was not good to have Abraham Lincoln's widow living in Germany without any money. One theory of Abraham Lincoln's assassination involved Mary's son Robert's drinking buddies, one of whom was John Wilkes Booth, who was 5 years older than Robert Lincoln, and the older brother, Edwin Booth, had rescued Robert Lincoln from falling between a moving train and the train platform in 1864. A runaway Confederate named Lewis Powell was John Wilkes Booth's favorite bodyguard, and Powell was well paid for staying by Booth's side. And on the Ides of March, on the 15th of March in 1865, Booth rented the presidential box at Ford's Theater for Powell and a friend and 2 girls. And on the 21st of March, Booth took Powell with him to New York and then to Canada. And on the 27th of March, they went together to watch La Forza del Destino at Ford's Theater. The Booths were a theater family, and Robert Lincoln had just come back from Harvard when Edwin Booth rescued him, and Robert Lincoln had been sent to Harvard in 1860 after just barely graduating high school, and at Harvard, Robert Lincoln had belonged to the Hasty Pudding Club that specialized in cocktails. Edwin Booth had grabbed his collar and pulled him back up from between the train and the platform, and during the war, Robert Lincoln was given a safe job procured for him by his mother on General Grant's staff, where the grown-ups could keep an eye on him. Everyone that age drinking in the taverns was attracted to the president's son, Robert Lincoln, and it was more than likely that the people working at the White House knew where young Robert Lincoln was spending his evenings, and in the bars, Edwin's younger brother, John Wilkes Booth, had been talking about killing Lincoln for so long that nobody took him seriously anymore, since he was a professional actor and being bombastic was just part of his personality. All of them were in high righteous spirits that fateful Friday on the 14th of April, having barely become used to the sting of defeat after the surrender at Appomattox 5 days before. And there were more people in the taverns than usual with the war winding down. Booth had been talking his usual trash that day at the saloon right next door to Ford's Theater, where the Star Tavern and the theater shared a common wall, and Booth had been bragging to his Confederate friends about how easy it would be to kill Lincoln, and Booth had been buying the drinks, as usual. Abraham Lincoln had attended Ford's Theater regularly ever since it had opened in August of 1863, and John Wilkes Booth had been one of the first actors hired, and Abraham Lincoln would bring his wife and children to sit in the presidential box with him, and Booth had once given Lincoln's young son Tad a rose. John Wilkes Booth was living at the National Hotel on 6th and Pennsylvania, and Vice President Johnson was living at the Kirkwood House Hotel on 12th and Pennsylvania, and Ford's Theater was on 10th Street, 2 blocks north of the Kirkwood. And the White House was 4 blocks away to the west. Pennsylvania Avenue was the main thoroughfare and was the only paved street, and in the spring of 1865, getting around the streets of Washington, D.C. was still done mostly on horseback or by buggies pulled by horses. Since 1862, the young men had been able to get around town on the new horse-drawn streetcars of the Washington and Georgetown Railroad along Pennsylvania Avenue, and Booth had been using Ford's Theater as his mailing address, and when he went to Ford's Theater around noon on the 14th of April to pick up his mail, Booth heard from the stagehands that President Lincoln and General Grant and their wives were going to attend the theater that evening at 8 o'clock. General Grant had been the first to win a victory fighting Confederates, and he'd been the one who accepted the final surrender at Appomattox the week before. And John Wilkes Booth would have not only cultivated Lincoln's son for the purpose of publicity and prestige, but would have enjoyed influencing him unduly against his Yankee father. Many of the young men for whom Booth was in the habit of buying drinks were the deserters and the medical misfits and runaways and displaced remnants of the shattered Confederate society that was everywhere that final year of the war. And Booth thought that as the news spread about the assassination of Lincoln, he would quickly become the hero of the South, but instead, Booth would be killed in a shootout on the 26th of April. Within hours of Lincoln's death, the police were at the boarding house of Mary Surratt, and she would hang, along with 3 young men, Lewis Powell and George Surratt and David Harold. Mary Surratt's boarding house was at what is now 604 H Street Northwest, and it was 5 blocks northeast of Ford's Theater, and Mary Surratt also owned a small compound across the Anacostia River in Maryland that was 10 miles away from her boarding house in town. And when the war had broken out, President Lincoln ordered many Confederate sympathizers in Maryland thrown in jail to prevent Washington, D.C. from being completely surrounded by Confederate states. The Surratt compound in Maryland was at a well-known crossroads and included a general store, a wheelwright shop, a stable, and a hotel, but most importantly, it housed a tavern where the disgruntled could sit all day airing their general grievances against the Yankee invasion. The Surratt compound in Maryland was a hotbed of Confederate sympathizers, and it had become large enough to be its own post office, and Mary Surratt's husband had been the official postmaster in 1854 at what was called Surrattsville. And after Mr. Surratt died of a sudden stroke in 1862, Mary Surratt moved into town in the fall of 1864. The widow and her son John Surratt would visit back and forth from town to the compound across the Anacostia, and even though the war had put an end to mail service to and from the South, the Surratt postman continued it in secret, and Mary Surratt rented out rooms in her boarding house 5 blocks away from Ford's Theater, mostly to Confederate sympathizers. After picking up his mail at Ford's Theater at noon and finding out that Lincoln was coming to the theater that night, Booth went up to Mary Surratt's and told George Surratt to meet him at the Kirkwood House Hotel, where Booth rented a room for George, and George Surratt would sit drinking in the bar of the Kirkwood Hotel, telling people that he was waiting for Booth, who never showed up that night. George Surratt walked around the streets of Washington, D.C., and then he went home to Germantown. And when Booth had paid for the room for George, Booth had left his bank book in the room for safekeeping, perhaps as a surety in the promise that he would be back that night. And testimony at the tribunal was that George said that Booth had told him to back up Harold, who was supposed to kill Johnson, so it must have been a spur-of-the-moment plan if this version from George had the players mixed around. Booth had gone to Vice President Johnson's residence at the Kirkwood Hotel earlier in the day and left a calling card, and installing George in a room there had been intended for a meeting with the new President Johnson as soon as Lincoln was dead. Johnson was known to be sympathetic to the South, and Booth figured that Johnson would reward him for having made a Johnson presidency possible. George Surratt had a carriage repair shop at Port Tobacco in Maryland, and he'd become a heavy drinker after his carriage business was disrupted by the war. George Surratt's family had come over from Germany 20 years previous and were living in a German community, and George could barely speak English. And along with Mary Surratt's son John Surratt, George would make a little money smuggling people and goods across state lines in his rowboat. George Surratt rented a room in town now and then, from Mary Surratt on his smuggling forays, but it's more likely in History Anonymous that George's name at Surratt, spelled so differently in the German ATZERODT, suffered from frequent transposing with the French name Surratt, Surratt. Whenever anyone asked where they could buy drugs and were told at Surratt's or try at Surratt's. George Surratt would hang for his dealings with Booth and for his crimes of smuggling during wartime, because smugglers were as good as spies, and in the wake of the assassination, Mary Surratt's son John would escape the gallows by fleeing the country. Lewis Powell and George were renting rooms from Mary Surratt on the 14th of April, and Powell had been a poor kid from the Deep South who enlisted in the Confederate Army in May of 1861, the month after he turned 17. And Powell was wounded at Gettysburg in 1863, shot in the wrist, and captured and sent to a Union hospital. Powell worked at that hospital as a nurse POW for 2 months, where he interacted with many Union soldiers, such as General Hancock, who'd been wounded in the leg during Gettysburg and taken to the same hospital. Powell was put on a train to Baltimore to work in another Union hospital, and he escaped from there. Within the week, helped in the escape by a nurse working at that hospital, and she took him to her mother's boarding house in Baltimore, where he stayed for 2 weeks, and then Powell made his way south to rejoin the fighting. The third person to hang was a pharmacy assistant named David Harold, whose job it was to make home deliveries of medications, and if Harold had been regularly delivering laudanum to the White House, he would have been delivering it to the Seward House as well, and Harold had also made 3 deliveries in the past to Mary Surratt's boarding house. Secretary of State Seward's house was 1 block north of the White House and 6 blocks west of Ford's Theater, and Secretary Seward was well known for helping get justice for free Americans of African descent, and Seward was laid up in bed from a carriage accident with a number of injuries, including a broken jaw and a broken arm. The president had invited his son Robert to the theater that night, but Robert had begged off, saying he was tired, and when Mary Lincoln balked at attending the theater by complaining of a headache, Abraham Lincoln may have enticed her by saying that he had ordered her laudanum delivered to the theater. Lincoln wanted to go because Robert E. Lee had surrendered 5 days ago, and over 1,000 people would be in the theater audience to share the joy. Many historians said that Lincoln enticed Mary to the theater by saying the newspapers had printed that they would attend that night, but that wasn't true, since the theater had only been told at noon, so the playbill did not announce his presence, although reproductions made later as souvenirs added a line that Lincoln would be at the performance, which meant that only the people at the theater would have known. When Harold came by horseback to the White House with a delivery on Friday morning, the 14th of April, he was told to take his delivery instead to Ford's Theater that evening, and upon arrival at the theater, Harold was told that the Lincolns were late, and it was suggested to him that he wait next door at the Star Tavern, so Harold walked into the saloon next door and sat down to wait. Harold was at the theater promptly at 7:30, and Booth arrived with Powell a little after 9 o'clock, chatting it up at the Star Tavern while Harold waited for the president to show up to sign for Mary Lincoln's laudanum, and John Wilkes Booth knew how to make friends fast. Harold also had a delivery to make that night to the Seward House, 6 blocks away, but the Lincoln order took precedence, and the president was very late getting to the theater. The play started at 8 o'clock, and sunset was at 7:45 p.m., and twilight ended at 8:15, and the owner of the Star Tavern would testify at the tribunal that he had known Harold since he was born and could thus identify him, and the owner also swore that he had served Booth a whiskey right before the assassination. Powell had told Harold not to worry, that it was getting late, that he was willing to go along with him to Seward's house since the streets were not safe after dark with all the disbanded soldiers wandering around, and Powell said that he had rented a horse waiting to be picked up 5 blocks away, while Harold's horse was tied up in the stables behind the theater. Powell regaled Harold with stories of his years of active combat experience fighting in the war, as well as sharing his knowledge of the blessing of morphine used in the Union hospitals, and Powell easily convinced the pharmacy assistant to take him along to Seward's house as an excellent bodyguard for the trip up to Secretary Seward's 1 block north of the White House. Harold agreed, and it was just young people enjoying themselves on that fine spring evening, and they were having the time of their lives, and they had money, and they had hope, and they had courage, and Booth would wait to make his move until Powell returned from Seward's house, since there was plenty of time left in the play, so Booth ordered another whiskey. The livery stable was on the corner of 6th and C Streets, 1/2 block north of the National Hotel, which was 1/2 block north of the train station. And Powell and Booth picked up their horses at 9 p.m. and went back to the Star Tavern, where Harold was waiting for Lincoln to show up to sign his pharmacy receipt. The president arrived in the middle of the second act, and Harold succeeded in obtaining the signature for the medication, which many thought was the delivery of a telegram, because that seemed more presidential than receiving a bottle of laudanum. The delivery boy, Harold, was from a better class of people than all of them, and Harold's father had been the chief clerk of the naval storehouse at the Washington Navy Yard for 20 years, and his family had been well off, and Harold had been sent to college, where he obtained his pharmacy license in 1860 from Georgetown College, and had then gotten the job as a pharmacist's assistant. Harold's family lived at 636 8th Street Southeast, near the Washington Navy Yard, 3 blocks away from the train car tracks along Pennsylvania Avenue, and 2 miles away from Ford's Theater by the horse-drawn streetcars using the railroad tracks that offered passenger service from the Capitol to the Navy Yard where Harold's father worked. When they got to the Seward residence 5 minutes later, Powell grabbed the medicine from Harold and said he'd take it up to the house, and Powell was 6'2" and built like a bull in his prime, so Harold held his horse while Powell went up the walk and knocked on the door. At a few minutes past 10 o'clock, Powell talked his way inside, saying that he had to instruct Seward on how to take the medicine, and he was able to get a good look at everyone in the house before he started attacking them, and Booth would shoot Lincoln at 10:25. When Harold had delivered the laudanum for which Lincoln signed, Harold had remarked that the box was unguarded, and then Lincoln's bodyguard, John Parker, came over to the Star Tavern to get a drink, and Booth found out from Parker that indeed he didn't need Powell as muscle getting into the president's box, or even for help with the evil deed. Back at Seward's house, Harold heard screaming and panicked and rode off while Powell was still in the house, and Powell seriously injured 5 people, leaving blood all over the place. The Secretary of State Seward survived the attack because of the considerable bandages and splints he'd been wearing, and others in the house were stabbed and slashed, while Harold tied Powell's horse to a tree and fled, abandoning Powell to whatever fate had befallen him. Harold hurried back to the Star Tavern to warn Booth that his friend Powell had just been murdered inside the Secretary of State's house, and Harold was arriving at the stables behind the theater just as Booth was riding away up the alley. And when Harold caught up with him, Booth was shouting that Lincoln had been shot down dead, and because Harold didn't know that Booth was the one who'd done it, they skedaddled away together. Harold assumed that the gunman at the theater had something to do with whoever had attacked Powell inside Seward's house, and that they were right in the middle of a last-ditch Confederate raid on the Capitol, and as they hurried away from Ford's Theater, Harold was shouting the news to Booth about his friend Powell having come to some harm yet unknown. When Booth had jumped down onto the stage after shooting Lincoln, he had landed badly and broken his tibia. But Booth had been so full of adrenaline and alcohol that he'd been able to reach the alley and gotten onto his horse, being held by a little boy named Peanut. And when they pulled up to catch their breath, Booth told Harold that he'd fallen and hurt his leg trying to escape from the pandemonium. Soon enough, Harold and Booth reached the Kirkwood Hotel, and Booth stayed outside in the back, sitting on his horse, waiting for George Atzerodt and Harold to help him into the room, and for them to take care of the horses. But George was not answering the door when Harold continued to knock. Inside the room, Booth knew they could take it easy for the rest of the night, awaiting the glory that would be theirs in the morning, but the desk clerk refused to open the door for Harold, who went back outside and told Booth to come talk to the desk clerk. By that time, the adrenaline and most of the alcohol had worn off, and Booth was in so much pain that he wanted Dr. Mudd to look at his injured leg. And Harold offered to take Booth to his own boss, who was a doctor, but Booth insisted on going to his friend Dr. Mudd across the river in Maryland, and Harold agreed to help him. Booth was wearing thigh-high leather boots, folded down into what was called a top boot, and Dr. Mudd would have to cut the boot along the front to remove it, slicing from the top of his foot all the way up his shin so the tight boot could be removed, and Dr. Mudd would fashion a splint for the leg that had broken a few inches above the ankle, and he would supply Booth with a pair of crutches. Getting across the bridge out of Washington, D.C. had been a problem, because Maryland was under military occupation and no civilians were allowed over any of the bridges after 9 p.m. And when Harold and Booth set out for Dr. Mudd's house, it was way past curfew. Harold put forth that getting across the bridge to Dr. Mudd's was no problem because of Harold's father's position working at the Navy Yard, so they could take the Navy Yard bridge, and the sentry agreed to let Booth across. If Harold would have just gone home, everything would have been all right for him. But if Washington, D.C. were under attack, Harold thought it would be safer to shelter in the southern sympathizing state of Maryland, and he knew that his father would be proud of him for taking that precautionary move, so after a few minutes Harold followed over the bridge after Booth. It was a little under 3 miles from the Kirkwood Hotel to the Navy Yard bridge, and after catching up with Booth, they rode 9 miles to the Surratt compound, and they would arrive right around midnight. Harold was operating under the assumption that Booth had been the victim of a terrible catastrophe, and that they had both narrowly escaped the last-ditch Confederate uprising of the night, some final mephitic attempt to punish the North, and Harold was a good boy who just wanted to be helpful. After successfully crossing the Navy Yard bridge over the Anacostia River and arriving at the Surratt compound, they were warned that the police were arresting people because Lincoln had been shot, and Booth and Harold were told it would be better for them to ride on to Dr. Mudd's house themselves, because the police were expected at any moment at the Surratt compound. Dr. Mudd had enrolled in the same Georgetown college where Harold had received his pharmacy license in 1860, and Dr. Mudd had enrolled in 1850 and gone on to study medicine in Baltimore, and Dr. Mudd had graduated in 1856. On the 23rd of December in 1864, Booth had gone out to look at some property that Dr. Mudd had for sale, and the doctor had introduced Booth to Mary's son John Surratt, and Mudd and Booth had come back that day to the National Hotel, where people remembered seeing them together because Booth had become quite famous and people were paying attention to whatever he did. That same day, on the 23rd of December, the day before Christmas Eve, Harold had been making a delivery out to Dr. Mudd's farm, and so he knew where it was, and even though he had just missed meeting John Wilkes Booth that day, Harold had gotten a positive impression about Dr. Mudd. The doctor lived 11 miles to the south of the Surratts, and Harold had already known John Surratt because Harold had attended the Charlotte Military Academy High School, which was 20 miles south of the Surratt compound, and Harold had traveled through the Surratts crossroads several times on his way to visit his family in Washington, D.C. on weekends and holidays, and after that he may have seen John Surratt and his friends on the streetcars around town. George Atzerodt and John Surratt were both smugglers, and the prime commodity to smuggle during the war between the states was morphine for wounded soldiers, especially those who were in danger of withdrawal. During the war, smugglers and blockade runners could be shot on the spot because there was little difference between a spy and a smuggler, and it's possible that Harold had been making money on the side under the color of humanitarianism, and Harold was only 2 years older than John Surratt, who would use George Atzerodt's rowboat at Port Tobacco. It was possible that meeting Harold that afternoon at the Star Tavern on the 14th of April had led George to believe that Booth and the nurse orderly Powell were just setting up a new morphine connection with Harold for the smuggling operation being run out of the Surratt compound, and so George would have been happy to go along with the arrangement, and at the tribunal George would swear that he had heard about Booth's plan to assassinate Lincoln only 2 hours before the shooting. It's also possible that he hadn't believed it because Booth was always talking that way, but what he knew for certain was that the thing with Harold was just business. Dr. Mudd lived in a house 20 miles southeast of Washington, D.C., just 10 miles north of where he'd been born and raised on his father's tobacco plantation where they had owned almost 100 slaves. And the Surratt compound was 10 miles north of Mudd's tobacco farm. And after Booth went to have Dr. Mudd set his broken leg, Booth and Harold ended up 4 miles east of Port Tobacco, and they hid out in the swamp for a week, hoping George would show up with Booth's bank book. But George had been arrested and was locked in shackles aboard a Union ironclad along with Powell. Booth and Harold finally found someone else to take them in a small boat across the Potomac into Virginia so Booth could get to the bank, and they were surrounded by Union soldiers, and Harold surrendered, but Booth refused and paid the price. The tribunal demanded that the crime be a Confederate scheme rather than some young people behaving badly, which is what young people do. And Powell was about to turn 21 years old, and Harold was about to turn 23, and Robert Lincoln was just about to turn 22, and would continue to hate Americans of African descent to his dying day. John Surratt had turned 21 years old the day before the assassination, and if Dr. Mudd had been involved in morphine smuggling, he would have known both of the local young men involved in the business, George Atzerodt and John Surratt. The Surratt compound in Maryland was at a major crossroads, through which Dr. Mudd would travel on his way back and forth from Washington, D.C., and so would have George Atzerodt, and the Union Army had built Camp Stanton just a couple miles east of Dr. Mudd's parents' plantation. Camp Stanton was a training camp for Union soldiers of African descent that was established in August of 1863, and the 7th Regiment of United States Colored Troops, USCT, had been organized in Baltimore and trained at Camp Stanton, and they were joined by the 9th, 19th, and 30th Regiments, and they all participated in hard combat during the final campaigns of the war. When Dr. Mudd had met John Wilkes Booth when the well-paid actor came out to inquire about the property Mudd was selling, and Dr. Mudd had come into town to have drinks with Booth at the National Hotel, they'd been joined by Louis Weichman, who was renting a room from Mary Surratt. John Wilkes Booth had been born and raised on a farm 10 miles northwest of Baltimore, and Baltimore was 35 miles north of Washington, D.C., along the Chesapeake Bay, and almost 9,000 soldiers of African descent were trained at Camp Stanton in Maryland, and from his parents' winter residence in Baltimore, Booth would have ridden on the train with the USCT soldiers, and both Powell, Weichman, and John Surratt would also have seen them on the train from Baltimore. Powell had deserted from the Confederate Army in January of 1865 and taken the train to Baltimore to see the nurse who had helped him, and he arrived in Baltimore on the 14th of January and moved in with the nurse, and Powell and John Wilkes Booth had probably met sometime on that train. John Surratt and Weichman bought a boat at Port Tobacco, where George Atzerodt was living, 20 miles south of the Surratt compound, and they bought the boat on the same day that Powell arrived in Baltimore, on the 14th of January, and Louis Weichman and John Surratt would go to Baltimore again on the 21st of January, and to explain the boat at the military tribunal, Powell came up with a story about Booth wanting to kidnap Lincoln, which had seemed more like a gentlemanly prank, since being a smuggler was the same as being a spy and could get them shot. Powell's lawyer had told him to just pretend he was crazy, so the story about wanting to kidnap Lincoln seemed to fit the bill. There had been hard shortages of morphine for some time, needed by the legions of wounded soldiers, and Powell didn't think it was fair that the North had so much more of the drug than the South, and the story about kidnapping Lincoln quickly evolved into their being able to ransom the president in exchange for some kind of prisoner swap, but more likely the demand from these young men would have been for morphine for the wounded Confederate soldiers, and that's why Louis Weichman and John Surratt had bought the boat with Booth's money on the 14th of January. Powell showed up at Mary Surratt's in early February asking for John Surratt, and Powell asked for a meal and a room, which she gave him when her son John arrived home, and vouched for Powell, who went back to Baltimore and got arrested for beating up a slave girl at the nurse's mother's boarding house on the 12th of March, an act that aroused suspicion that Powell was a Confederate spy, but he was let out of jail 2 days later. Powell took the train back to the Surratt boarding house in Washington, D.C., and he stayed for 3 days and left again, and it was more than likely that after the attack on Secretary Seward, Powell had been on his way back to his girlfriend in Baltimore. First, Powell had gone back to Ford's Theater to tell Booth what he'd done, and then continued on to the Kirkwood, where George no longer was, and Powell's rented horse would be found later at Eastern Avenue and Bladensburg Road, abandoned 4 miles north of the Navy Yard Bridge, on the border with Maryland, less than a mile away from another bridge over the Anacostia River, so it seems he was on his way to get to the railroad station outside the metropolitan area where he could safely board the train to Baltimore, but he'd not been able to get across the bridge to the train station in Bladensburg because of the heightened military alert after the assassination, and so Powell had gone to ground. Instead of taking the B&O to Baltimore, Powell had turned around and gone back to Mary Surratt's boarding house on foot, and the horse was abandoned because the police would probably be looking for it, and stealing horses was a hanging offense. 3 days later, Powell arrived on foot at Mary Surratt's boarding house 5 blocks away from Ford's Theater, and he was arrested right away, and in his pocket was the hotel address and room number of his Baltimore nurse girlfriend. The police had been at the boarding house within hours after the assassination, but had found nothing, and so they watched and waited, and Powell showed up late Monday night, and Mary Surratt claimed not to know him. The newspapers would say that it took 4 hours for the Metropolitan Police to show up at the boarding house because they needed to explain how John Surratt had time to escape their dragnet. And when Powell showed up after dark on Monday night, the police who were waiting in surveillance had people with them who were witnesses to Powell's vicious attack on the Secretary of State, and the police took the whole lot of them at the boarding house into custody. The authorities called it a Confederate conspiracy of spies, and Mary Surratt would hang alongside a nurse orderly, a pharmacy assistant, and a drug smuggler. And Dr. Mudd told the authorities that Booth had told him the broken leg was from his horse falling on him, not from leaping from the presidential box onto the stage after shooting Lincoln, and the attack on the Secretary of State had been consistent with Powell's method of frightening the Yankees into agreeing that it was best not to have to face any further action from the Southern soldiers and their terrifying zeal. And Powell had hoped that the Confederate General Joe Johnston would rally his 89,000 troops to force an armistice with the new President Johnson that would include more independence for a post-war South, but it was not to be. Powell knew that the North could not be beaten, and he also knew that they were as weary of the war as was the South. But what Powell didn't know was that Lincoln had already been negotiating a peace with General Joe Johnston, an arrangement that accommodated all the conciliatory points being asked by the South, including the reestablishment of state governments and civilian benefits and civil rights allowances that would bring about a compassionate and forgiving end to the war. The actions of Booth and Powell actually hurt the South, because with the death of Lincoln, General Grant assumed authority under martial law, and Grant's military-only concessions would prevail rather than Lincoln's leniency. General Joe Johnston finally surrendered on the 26th of April, followed by some outliers during the first week of May, and Powell's unit was one that held out for a week following Lincoln's assassination, and they were known as Mosby's Rangers or Mosby's Irregulars, and Powell himself had been one of Mosby's favorite men. On Monday morning after Lincoln was killed, General Joe Johnston contacted the Union General Sherman to ask for a meeting at a farmhouse in Durham, North Carolina, and they talked for a day and signed an agreed peace. But when John Wilkes Booth turned out to be a Confederate conspiracy rather than a crazy lone gunman, the better deal given General Joe Johnston was withdrawn as soon as Booth was certifiably dead just after dawn on the 26th of April, and a harsher military surrender was imposed that day in Durham by order of General Grant. Mosby's Rangers had begun as the 43rd Virginian, and Mosby's Rangers had grown to 400 men by February of 1864, and they were little better than a roving band of thieves, and their order of battle was to sneak behind enemy lines and carry out acts of terror. Mosby's base of operations was in Middleburg, Virginia, 40 miles west of Washington, D.C., and Mosby's Irregulars had used the Potomac River while carrying out their dirty work against the Union, and they also used Maryland as a staging area. The irregular squads, like Mosby's Rangers, had been ordered by the Confederate Congress to disperse at the beginning of 1864 because the regular soldiers were jealous of them, watching them sleeping in warm houses and being allowed to keep the booty from their plundering raids, and the disparity between the privations of the regular soldier and the irregular raiders was too painful to maintain the army's morale. Despite the decree to stand down, 2 groups of them continued to operate outside even the reach of the Confederate Congress, and one of them was Mosby's Rangers. Powell was sent with a squad to Richmond in December of 1864, and what he saw in the city convinced him that the cause was lost, and perhaps what was left of his conscience made Powell realize that he'd been living a privileged life as a Mosby Raider, and that when the war was over he would be held to account for what he'd done while the people in the southern cities were suffering so terribly, and Richmond was second only to Atlanta in importance to the South. Mosby's Rangers had often discarded all semblance of a uniform during or after their operations, and they would melt in among the civilian population, and in September of 1864, Union forces had executed 7 of Mosby's men who'd been caught out of uniform, and Mosby executed 7 Union prisoners in reprisal. Powell had been with Mosby from the 1st of October in 1863 until he deserted in January of 1865, so he not only would have known the men executed, but would have known who'd been responsible for it, and there is a good possibility that when Powell entered the Seward House on the 14th of April, 7 months later, one of those Union officers had been on the premises. In the Seward House that night, among others, was George Robinson in uniform, and Robinson was a soldier from Maine who'd fought under General Butler, the man who had not only formed the USCT regiment, but had appointed officers of African descent to command them. Butler had given out 200 medals to the USCT, along with 15 of them receiving the Medal of Honor, and Butler had used USCT troops in the Battle of Chaffin's Farm in September of 1864, attacking the defenses around Richmond that had been besieged by Grant for so long that year, and Hancock's attack there in August had caused Robert E. Lee to abandon any hope of sending reinforcements to the Shenandoah Valley. Seward's 3rd son, William Seward, was 25 years old, married with 2 children. And he'd become a colonel in June of 1864, and this young William had fought under Grant in the early Shenandoah campaign, where he'd been plagued by Mosby's Rangers. In retaliation for Mosby's raids in the Kanawha River Valley, General Grant had ordered the scorched earth of the Shenandoah Valley in 1864 that was called the Burning, meant to deprive the Confederate Army of sustenance, and the order to destroy all their farms and houses included the words barren waste, and it had been this denuding of the breadbasket of the South that had led to Powell's desertion in January of 1865. Mosby had disbanded rather than surrendering at the end of the war, and because Mosby was more of a partisan guerrilla than an officer, a price had been put on his head by the Union General Hancock, first for $2,000 and then for $5,000, because Hancock knew that Mosby had been Powell's commander, and Mosby turned himself in on the 17th of June, rather than wait to be brought before the Lincoln Conspiracy Tribunal. To make up for all that, Mosby would faithfully serve the United States for the rest of his life, after switching parties to become a Republican and working as one of General Grant's and then President Grant's favorites. Among Mosby's accomplishments would be bringing justice to the cattleman wars in the West, uprooting graft in the opium trade in China, indicting corrupt attorneys in the Department of Justice, and bringing charges of fraud against people trying to cheat the Indians. Mosby would be forced to retire at the age of 74, blind in one eye and cantankerous, and forced retirement would leave Mosley more time to play with the young George Patton, recreating Civil War battles with Mosby playing himself and Patton playing Robert E. Lee. One requirement for being a Mosby man had been that recruits needed to bring their own horse, and at the close of 1864 Powell sold his horse in Richmond and bought a train ticket to Baltimore, and while Powell was spending time with John Wilkes Booth in the spring of 1865, his former commander had been on the way to join up with General Joe Johnston. Newspapers were full of news about all the brave Southern commanders, and Powell still thought of himself as a soldier for the South, but instead of dying as a soldier with honor, he would hang as a common highwayman.